My son-in-law showed up at my door with a pot of homemade soup, a special pre-op meal just for me. Because of my heart, I only tasted one spoonful and carried the rest to my 78-year-old neighbor instead. An hour later, she was on a stretcher, convulsing, while he called me, gasping, "Oh God, you didn't eat it? Not a single bite?" That was the moment I realized the soup was never meant to comfort me. Before we move on, I just want to say thank you. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. My name is Harold Fenton, 60 years old. I've lived alone in a small Oregon town since my wife died. For years, this house has only echoed with the wind through the porch and the heavy thud of my own heart climbing the stairs. I'm about to have heart surgery. The doctor said the risk was high. I pretended to be calm, but truthfully, every night I saw myself walking on a rotten wooden bridge, swaying with each step. That afternoon, my kitchen glowed red with the last light of day. The old kitchen, with its chipped wooden countertop, a small radio softly playing country tunes. The scent of dried floral tea still lingered from the morning. I was standing by the sink, drying some porcelain plates, when I heard a knock. When I opened it, I saw Damien Crow, my son-in-law, standing there. He was smiling, as if we were two old, good friends. His shirt was crisp, his hair neatly combed. I always thought he was polite, articulate, successful, the kind of person everyone wants to trust. He flashed a radiant smile. In his hands, a steaming pot of soup. The rich aroma instantly made the kitchen feel unusually warm. He said he cooked it especially for me. For Dad preparing for pre-op, I'd never seen him cook anything himself, but that day he seemed uncharacteristically thoughtful. His eyes lit up as he looked at the pot in his hands. I'm on a low-salt diet for my heart. The doctor strictly warned me to avoid it. I told him this. But Damien kept urging, "Just try one spoonful, Dad. I made it." I indulged him, tasting just a small spoonful. It was just okay, nothing special. Bland, a bit fatty. I put the spoon down immediately and thanked him. Damien watched me for a bit too long. His gaze tried to read my reaction, tried to see if I intended to eat more. At the time, I just thought he was worried I was a picky eater, afraid I'd dislike it. I had no idea that look held a different meaning. Deeper. More terrifying. I decided not to keep the soup at home. I took the whole pot over to Mrs. Alden, my widowed neighbor, 78 years old. Hair as white as snowflakes. I considered her like a sister, often visiting to chat. She lived alone, usually eating simple meals, so I thought she'd enjoy a hearty soup. I even joked with her, "Try my son-in-law's soup, see if you like it. He's very thoughtful." Mrs. Alden smiled gently. She took the pot with trembling hands, saying she'd reheat it for dinner. She thanked me profusely. I felt warm inside. An hour later, just as I was about to make a cup of tea, sirens wailed, tearing through the neighborhood's quiet. Red and blue lights flashed through the window, blinking rapidly, painting a corner of my kitchen with an ominous glow. I ran to the porch. An ambulance was parked squarely in front of Mrs. Alden's house. Then police cars arrived too. 2 paramedics were rushing to carry her out the door. Mrs. Alden was convulsing, vomiting. Her eyes rolled back. She looked absolutely horrifying. I froze. My legs buckled, step by step, on the cold stone steps. I asked them what happened, my voice trembling, unable to form words. One person spoke quickly, still busy pushing the stretcher. "Signs of poisoning. We need to get her to the hospital immediately." Around us, neighbors began to gather, whispering, pointing. The sky seemed to darken even though the sun hadn't fully set. A cold sensation ran down my spine. Just then, my phone rang. Damien. His name lit up brightly on the screen. I answered, my eyes still fixed on the stretcher being loaded into the ambulance. His voice came through, higher than usual, slightly shaking, as if he'd run a very long distance to call me. Dad, have you eaten the soup yet? I froze. That question? I spoke slowly, word by word, trying to suppress my panic. I only tasted one spoonful. I took it over to Mrs. Alden. Why? The other end was silent. So silent, I thought he'd hung up. Heavy, as if someone was choking the air between us. I could only hear his rapid breathing. Then suddenly, he let out a sound like stifled crying. A sniffle. Almost a suppressed scream. Oh, God. You didn't eat it? You really didn't eat it? Not a single bite? I frowned. What do you mean? Why are you asking that? Mrs. Alden is in the ambulance. He stammered something I couldn't quite hear. Another long pause. I sensed something abnormal. A decent person would worry about the neighbor. Would ask if she'd be okay. Would ask if they could help. But Damien only focused on one question: had I eaten it or not? He didn't mention Mrs. Alden at all. I spoke, trying to calm my voice, but my heart pounded in my chest. Damien, tell me, what's wrong? What happened to her? He swallowed hard enough that I could hear it. His voice snapped, broken, as if he was wrestling with himself. Dad, you shouldn't have. You were supposed to. He stopped, then breathed heavily, like someone who had just witnessed something beyond their control. A plan that had just collapsed. A chill began to run down my spine, an icy sensation from my neck downwards. The soup was still in Mrs. Alden's sink. She was on a stretcher. My son-in-law was panicking because I hadn't eaten it. Everything spun in my head like shattered glass, reflecting a horrifying truth I didn't want to face. I spoke again, trying to keep my voice as calm as possible. Damien, why are you reacting like this? Is something wrong with the soup? He was silent. Impossibly long. I clearly heard the ambulance door close, the siren fading away. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, as if pulled into some dark corner. Dad, you shouldn't have given it to anyone. You should have eaten it. The phone disconnected. I stood on the porch. My hand still held the phone with its dark screen. In my head, there was only one question, echoing like a church bell at night. Why was my son-in-law so afraid? Just because I didn't eat a pot of soup? I looked over at Mrs. Alden's house. Lights were still on. The door still open. The pot lay overturned on the dining table, its lid on the floor. Suddenly, everything around me felt alien. My house. The street. The late afternoon sun. Even that seemingly harmless pot of soup. It wasn't harmless anymore. A kind gift had just turned into a disaster. And Damien's reaction, it was nothing like an innocent person's. Impossible. I stood still for a very long time. The whole neighborhood seemed to sink into an eerie silence. Until police car lights flashed in my front yard, and an officer stepped out, heading straight for me. Mr. Fenton, we need to talk to you about the soup. I knew this wasn't just about a neighbor anymore. This was about me. About the life I thought was peaceful. And to understand why, I had to go back to the beginning. Back to the days I thought Damien was a good man. Back to all the times I ignored my gut feelings. Back to when I started getting weak, and he started caring a little too much. I took a deep breath. My chest filled with the cold evening air, and I told them everything from the start. I thought I'd grown used to the quiet of this house, but ever since my wife passed, that quiet, it stopped being peaceful. It's like someone unplugged my life, left cold, empty spaces. My mornings repeat like an old clock. Warm water, 2 heart pills. The gentle creak of the floorboards as I step into the kitchen. I still keep the teapot my wife loved, even though its lid is chipped. I put water in the kettle, listen to it hiss and bubble, then sit at the dining table, looking out at the backyard, where the shadow of the old pear tree still falls on the ground. A habit replacing me on days I no longer have the strength to water it. The sparrows still sing, but I don't hear them anymore. Life after my wife's death became a long string of days, where I taught myself to accept loneliness, like a difficult friend. I sweep the yard in the early morning, watching each dry leaf swirl in the breeze. I check the mailbox every afternoon, hoping for a letter that isn't a bill. I try to eat enough, even though nothing tastes good anymore. Every time I go for a heart checkup, I drive her old car. The driver's seat still carries the faint scent of her perfume, as if she's still sitting right beside me. And every time the doctor mentions surgery, I look down at my hands. Hands calloused from years of labor. I wonder if I have enough courage, or if I should just let things take their natural course. Lying on an operating table, alone, that's what I've avoided the longest. I found out about my heart condition 2 years ago. Initially, just mild fatigue after walking a few blocks. Then chest pain. By the 3rd checkup, the doctor said, "You should have surgery before your condition worsens. The risk is high if you delay." Sounds simple. Easy as a bowl of soup. But I knew it wasn't. Not at all. My daughter moved to another state after she got married, over a 10-hour drive away. She still video calls on weekends. Still asks if I'm eating enough, taking my medicine regularly. But distance is distance. She has her own family now, her own job, 2 young kids, full of energy, full of schoolwork. Sometimes she says, "Dad, let me buy a ticket to come take care of you for a few days." I always tell her I'm fine, that her happiness is enough. I don't want to be a burden. And then, for some reason, Damien, my son-in-law, became the one who appeared most often in my life. Not because we were close, not because we shared hobbies, but because he wanted to. He volunteered, took the initiative. Damien is in his late 30s, always in crisp shirts, a hint of expensive cologne on his wrist. His hair always perfectly slicked back. He works in finance, something like that. At first, I couldn't remember what it was. Now I don't think I need to. He speaks smoothly, so easy on the ears that I once thought, my daughter is so lucky to find such a thoughtful man. He always seemed thoughtful. Bringing groceries, asking if anything needed fixing around the house, even offering to book my appointments. Some afternoons, he'd drop by, just to bring a bag of oranges or a jar of wild honey. And I thought it was kindness, the care of a good son-in-law. I didn't realize when it happened. When my private affairs, things I never wanted anyone else to touch, things I always arranged myself, slipped into his hands. So naturally, as if I were a 3-year-old child who knew nothing. One day, he asked, his voice natural, as if it were nothing special. "Dad, would you like me to help you check your online accounts? Online banking is so complicated. It'd be a hassle if you forgot your password when you needed it." I nodded. Without thinking, loneliness makes people trust quickly, makes them give up easily. Then he talked about hospital bills. "If you have surgery, the cost will be huge. I can take care of it first, and we'll figure out the details later. I know people at the insurance company. They can speed up the process." It sounded reasonable. A successful man wanting to help his ailing father-in-law. I was touched. I felt lucky. After that, he brought up power of attorney. Gently, as if my giving him full financial authority was a given. a favor I was bestowing upon him. Think about it, Dad. I can only take good care of you if you trust me. The older you get, the harder it is to manage everything. If you have a power of attorney, if something happens to you, I can handle things more easily. The way he said it, almost like my independence was an inconvenience. To him. Another time, he drove me to an appointment. When the doctor left the room, Damien leaned against the wall, arms crossed, looking at me with eyes that were half pity, half calculation. He spoke softly but clearly, as if sharing a secret with me. The older you get, Dad, the harder it is to manage everything. If you moved into a nursing home nearby, things would be easier for the whole family. You'd have care. You'd have friends. Easier for whom? I wanted to ask. But I just gave a weak smile. Said I wasn't ready. I still loved this house. More and more, his questions about my finances grew detailed. Digging into corners I'd never told anyone but my wife. How much do you have left in your retirement savings account? Is this house paid off? Do you have the deed, Dad? Does your insurance have any critical illness clauses or death benefits? Do you want to transfer ownership of anything to me just in case you don't make it after the surgery? To avoid paperwork hassle for your daughter, I reassured myself that he was just overly worried. Thoughtful. I convinced myself he cared. He was my daughter's husband, after all. The man she chose. He couldn't be bad. Could he? After decades of marriage to my wife, I thought I was good at reading people. Reading every glance, every smile. But it turns out that confidence died with her. I grew weaker. More tired after every morning sweep of the yard. I gasped for breath just bending down to tie my shoelaces. Like an old machine slowing down in my chest. And when someone like Damien kept appearing, right when I was at my lowest, always saying things like, "Let me handle it. Just let me do everything, Dad. Just trust me," I let myself drift. Not exactly trusting, but too weak to resist. Loneliness made me readily accept any favor. I remember one time he opened my fridge, shook his head. A long, drawn-out sigh. "Dad, how can you eat like this? All cold stuff. How about I bring you meals every week? I'll cook for you. Good intentions." But his eyes at that moment made me uneasy. It was like I wasn't the owner of this house anymore. He was controlling everything. And then I realized, when did I give Damien the spare key? Perhaps the day I felt dizzy and he led me to a chair. Poured me a glass of water. My hands were shaking then. And he said, casually, "Just give me the key, Dad. If something happens, I can come over. What if you fall?" I gave it to him. Didn't think anything of it. A small decision. But gradually, these small things piled up, forming a large shadow that fell over my life, obscuring what I should have seen. The moment that should have warned me, I let it pass. It was a cold evening. Damien stood on the porch, hands in his coat pockets. Half joking, half serious. His breath, a white cloud in the frigid air. "If you don't make it through the surgery, Dad, your daughter and I will have a mountain of paperwork. Such a hassle." I managed a strained laugh. "I'm not dead yet. No need to worry," he replied immediately, his voice chillingly calm. "I know, but it's better to be prepared." Hearing that, now that I think back, a shiver still runs down my spine. A chilling prophecy. At the time, I saw nothing wrong. Because when people are lonely, they easily forgive uncomfortable remarks. They'll think they're being too sensitive. They'll find every reason to believe others are kind. I was that kind of person. A lonely, weak, trusting old man. Until the ambulance lights flashed down the street. Until I saw Mrs. Alden being carried away on a stretcher. Until my son-in-law panicked because I wouldn't eat a bowl of soup. All those times he was kind to me, they suddenly lined up. A straight, terrifying row. I didn't want to look. They weren't acts of care. They were sharp arrows. And in that moment, I knew it was time to return to the present, where everything began to crumble, where his calls came relentlessly, where the first wave of unease tightened its grip on my chest and wouldn't let go. The ambulance had just turned the corner when my phone rang again. The screen lit up with a name I didn't want to see right then, Damien. I hadn't even caught my breath after what I'd just witnessed. The red and blue siren of the ambulance still echoed somewhere in my head, and my phone vibrated a second time, then a third. He just kept calling, as if trying to pierce through my fake calm. I answered. His voice wasn't normal, urgent, sharp, as if something was burning behind him. Something truly terrible had just happened. Dad, have you eaten that pot of soup? Have you eaten it? I told him I hadn't. I repeated that I was on a salt-free diet. There was silence on the other end for a second, just 1 second. But that silence felt like someone had dropped a stone onto my chest, heavy and terrifying. Then he barraged me with questions. Each one shot out. Not a single bite, Dad. Are you sure? Did you taste? Did you try any at all? Did anyone else eat it? What about Mrs. Alden? I looked down at my hands, still trembling slightly. I spoke clearly, tried to keep my voice steady. No, I only tasted a spoonful. I gave it to Mrs. Alden. He gasped. His breathing was loud and clear over the phone. Oh my God, why did you do that? Who did you give it to? Can you say it again, the whole pot? I repeated it, like a machine. I gave it to her. I didn't eat it. The whole pot. His voice broke, mixed with sniffling. Do you know she has underlying conditions? Do you know, at that age, with that health, she wouldn't be able to handle it? I cut him off. My voice was starting to show irritation. Why are you so panicked? What's going on? Tell me clearly. I heard him try to compose himself, but every word trembled. I just worry you'd eat too much salt. Your heart is weak. The doctor warned you. I'm just worried about you, Dad. The explanation sounded smooth, plausible, but the panic in his voice didn't match the reason. He didn't ask, is she okay? He didn't ask, where did they take her? He didn't even ask, are you okay, Dad? He only asked if I'd eaten, as if that answer decided everything. I repeated it slowly, as if trying to force each word directly into his head, not giving him a chance to evade. I didn't eat it. I'm on a salt-free diet. You know that perfectly well. He sighed, a long, drawn-out sigh that sounded like a collapse, like a building crumbling down. Good. That's good. As long as you're okay, Dad. Not a single word about Mrs. Alden's condition, not a shred of genuine concern, just a terrifying relief because I hadn't eaten it. I hung up while he was still trying to say more. In that moment of silence, I heard my heart pound in my chest. 1 beat, 2 beats. Not from illness, but from instinct. That instinct where an old man like me sometimes just needs to smell the wind to know something bad is coming. It felt like someone had just placed an icy hand on my shoulder. I turned back to the kitchen. The pot of soup still sat there on the table, the lid slightly ajar. A few streaks of liquid clung to the rim inside. Its color, I hadn't noticed it this afternoon. Its smell, I hadn't noticed that either. Damien had placed it on the kitchen counter with a confident smile, as if he knew I would definitely eat it, as if there was no other script, no other outcome than that pot of soup going straight into my stomach, not a shred of doubt. When I recalled his gaze as he said, I cooked this for you, Dad, a shiver ran down my spine, not because of the soup itself, but because I saw it all again. Every small piece, every detail I'd overlooked. The time he asked for specifics about my heart medication, the time he suggested I sign power of attorney papers, the time he said, just in case something happens to you, Dad. Back then, I thought it was concern, the worry of a son-in-law. Now, I wasn't so sure anymore. Now I saw them as leading questions, as groundwork. I sat down, stared at the pot for a moment longer. It felt like it was staring back at me, with empty, terrifying eyes, an inanimate object that could still send shivers down one's spine. Then came a knock at the door. It wasn't anyone else. It was the police. They asked if I had brought a pot of soup to Mrs. Alden's house. I nodded. They asked for the rest, to take it for testing. I stood up, carried the pot with both hands. As I handed it to them, I instinctively gripped it a little tighter, as if letting go would make everything crumble before me. Every doubt, every instinct, all of it was coming true. An officer asked me, his voice grave, "Did you eat any of it?" I said no. He looked straight into my eyes, as if checking if I was lying, a piercing gaze. Good, because if you had eaten it, we'd probably be talking in the emergency room right now instead of here. That sentence numbed me. It felt like all the strength had been drained from my body. I couldn't answer anything. I just watched his gloved hands carefully place the pot of soup into an evidence bag, a scene I was familiar with from all the crime shows I'd watched. I never thought it would happen in my own small kitchen, right here on the dining table I used every day. They invited me to the hospital to answer a few questions, just in case further clarification is needed. I stood still by the door for a few seconds after they left. The house was silent, as if all the air had been sucked out. Only the grandfather clock ticked, one beat at a time, steady but chillingly cold. I looked down at my phone. Damien was calling again, the same number. I hung up. There was too much I didn't understand. But one thing I knew for sure, the unease in my heart. It wasn't vague anymore. It had become a cold, hard knot. And I had to find answers immediately. I got to the hospital just as night fully fell. The main lobby was so cold, goosebumps rose on my skin. The strong smell of disinfectant intensified with every step. Announcements echoed over the loudspeakers, sounding like voices from another world. The long rows of gleaming metal chairs under the fluorescent lights, they immediately brought back memories of my last heart checkup, the one where the doctor said if I delayed surgery, I could collapse at any moment. That day, I sat just like this, hands clasped, trying to breathe steadily, trying to suppress the fear. A doctor emerged. He asked my name. Then he sat in the chair opposite me, a thick file clutched in his hands. His gaze was serious, no warmth at all. Regarding Mrs. Alden's condition, we've stabilized her for now. She's out of critical danger, but she shows very clear signs, consistent with acute poisoning. My heart skipped a beat, as if someone had squeezed it tight. I immediately asked, my voice hoarse, "Poisoning? From what? Was it that soup?" They didn't have a definitive answer, but I saw the doctor's chest rise and fall, as if he too was holding back something difficult to say. Then they asked me a series of questions, down to the minute details. Who delivered the soup? Who cooked it? What time did I receive it? Did I check the ingredients? Did I taste it? How much was left? Could anyone else have touched it? Who had access? I answered each question. The more I spoke, the more a lump formed in my throat. Not from fatigue, but from fear. Fear that the next question would hit exactly what I was avoiding thinking about, what I refused to believe. I didn't even understand why I was avoiding it. Maybe I still wanted to believe it was all just a coincidence, some kind of misunderstanding. They led me to another room, told me to wait. The room was small, just a table, 2 chairs, and stark white walls. I looked at the white walls, at the clock, at the flickering hall light. Every hospital chime sounded like metal grating, tearing through the eerie silence. My mind spun like an old fan, whirling endlessly. The soup, Damien's frantic calls, his unusually long silence, his scrutinizing gaze when he stood in the kitchen. Each small piece, every word, every glance, they all flooded back, assembling into a terrifying shape. A lab technician walked in. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes. He held a results paper. I immediately recognized the "I don't know where to begin" look on the face of someone delivering bad news. Mr. Fenton, in the remaining soup sample, we found traces of a substance that strongly affects the heart. A toxin. I asked, my voice trembling. Is it heart medication? Like the one I take? Not exactly. It's more like a high-dose sedative or a neurovascular inhibitor. But for an elderly person with underlying cardiovascular disease, it's enough to cause acute heart failure. Enough to end everything. My back went cold. My whole body felt like it was dissolving into smoke. My vision blurred. So, if I had eaten it? He didn't continue. He just looked at me. That look was enough for an answer. It said I'd been horrifyingly lucky. I swallowed. My throat was dry as sand. I placed my hands on my thighs. They felt alien, ice cold. A moment later, I managed to speak, my voice filled with guilt. Mrs. Alden, she didn't know anything. I gave it to her without thinking. I harmed her. The doctor placed a hand on the back of the chair, looking at me with sympathy. We're doing everything we can. She'll be all right. I looked down at the floor, where the overhead light cast a long streak. I imagined if I hadn't skipped salt that day, if I'd just eaten one more spoonful, one more bowl, perhaps the person lying motionless in the emergency room amidst machines and wires would be me. A simple thought, but it was like a cold wave washing from the nape of my neck down my spine, then spreading to my fingertips. It wasn't imagination. It was a truth that almost happened. A police officer entered next. He had a stern demeanor. He sat next to me, his voice even, but every word felt like a hammer blow to my skull. We need you to tell us more about your relationship with the person who brought the soup. Who suggested the surgery? Who mentioned the power of attorney papers? Who brought up managing your finances? How did those conversations play out? I heard each question, and it was as if someone was wiping away every "I tried to believe" moment from the past several months. Every facade of goodwill crumbled. I recounted everything. I made it clear he was my son-in-law, made it clear he always acted thoughtful, asked detailed questions about my medication, about my money, suggested signing papers for convenience. I recalled every instance he'd hovered around the topic of my savings account. Every time he'd said, "Dad, let me take care of it." The officer wrote continuously. I heard his pen scratching on the paper, sharp as a knife blade. Every word I spoke was evidence. When I stopped, the room suddenly became too quiet. I could hear the steady hum of the air conditioner above, the distant whir of a ventilator. The officer asked, looking directly into my eyes without a hint of evasion, "Do you believe the person who brought the soup might have put poison in it to kill you?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at the wall in front of me, at its white color. That white color reminded me of Damien's hand on my shoulder the day he brought the soup. "Dad, try to eat and get strong. I cooked it." A normal sentence, one that would warm anyone's heart. But now it echoed in my mind like the clang of an iron door closing, a death knell. I took a long breath. My chest felt tight. I'm not sure, but everything is aligning in a way that's very hard to ignore, a terrifying way. The doctor returned, offering more information about Mrs. Alden's condition. I listened, but my ears kept ringing. In my mind, only fragments spun endlessly. My heart condition, the upcoming surgery, the soup, Damien's panicked calls, his insistent questions, the repeated suggestions about power of attorney. It was all a plan. I stood up. The whole room seemed to tilt as I took my first step. I lightly gripped the edge of the table, holding onto it like a lifeline. A thought materialized in my head, not a question, but a solid, cold truth, sharp as a knife blade. If that soup wasn't meant for Mrs. Alden, then who was it for? It was for me. I closed my eyes for a second, then opened them. The hospital lights gleamed on the tiled floor like a path leading straight to the door. I knew where I had to go next. I had to get answers directly from the mouth of the man who brought that soup to my house on that seemingly ordinary afternoon. The son-in-law I had trusted. I stepped into the yard. Damien was there, waiting. Hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, face taut. Under the porch light, he looked like a ghost, all shadows and sharp edges. He met my gaze. Then, a voice, forced worried, laced with feigned concern. "Dad, the hospital. What did they say? Is she going to make it? I'm so worried." I didn't rush to answer. Just opened the door. Flicked on the light. The yellow glow spilled out, stretching his long shadow across the path. He followed me inside, a torrent of words tumbling out, as if to fill the sudden silence with his excuses. "Maybe she just ate something else, Dad. Don't overthink it. At that age, food can be tricky. Don't jump to conclusions." I hung my coat on the chair. Turned to face him, my eyes emptied of trust, locked onto his. "How did you know I was home when you brought the soup?" He froze. Just for a beat. then stumbled. Well, I just guessed. You're usually home around then. I saw your car. I nodded slowly. My voice dropped, soft, but each word a pinprick. And you called right after the ambulance left? Where were you standing? You saw Mrs. Alden being carried out? A slight twitch. His eyes darted. I was just driving by. This road's on my way to work. At that exact minute, my voice still low pressed each word into the floor. Just as the ambulance turned away, he offered a twisted smile. It didn't reach his eyes. What are you thinking, Dad? I was worried about you. That's why I asked if you ate. Your heart, Dad. The doctor warned you. Funny, I found that odd myself. I crossed my arms, leaned against the table's edge, my gaze unwavering. Why did you ask if I ate? More than you asked if she would survive? You didn't ask about her, not a single word. This time he swallowed hard. His throat bobbed. You're misunderstanding. I just worried you'd eat too much salt. Worried you wouldn't keep your strength. The doctor's orders, Dad. I let the silence settle. The clock's ticking was suddenly loud. Then, very calmly, as if recounting an old tale, the hospital found poison in the soup. He recoiled, half a step back as if slapped with ice water, his face bone white. What? No, that's impossible. They must be wrong. It has to be something else she ate. She eats all sorts of things. I gave them the exact pot of soup you brought. His mouth opened. No sound came out. His eyes flickered to the door, a trapped animal looking for an escape. I took a step forward. Slowly. Like an old predator closing in. You call me Dad. You brought soup on the very day of my pre-surgery checkup. You know how serious my heart condition is. You kept asking if I ate. And now, the person in the ER is the neighbor. All these pieces. You put them together. He stammered. His voice trembled. Dad, don't talk like that. I only wanted to help you. I was worried. I've heard enough. Help me or help yourself. He let out a sharp, ragged breath, like he'd been holding it for too long, like a cornered beast. And then, in that moment of lost control, he said exactly what I'd been waiting for. Every word, an icy stone against my face. You're having surgery soon. You know how difficult that case is. If something happened after you'd signed the power of attorney to me, everything would be less complicated for everyone, for both you and her. I stood still. His words echoed, clear and sharp in the quiet room. No other sound dared intrude. He realized his slip, grabbed for the next sentence, trying to mend the tear. I mean, less complicated for you. You wouldn't have to worry about paperwork or procedures. I'd handle everything. And my savings account? I cut him off, my voice cold. And your constant questions about insurance? And your repeated suggestions that I sign over power of attorney, even though I never agreed? He raised a hand to his forehead, wiping away a bead of sweat. I just wanted to make sure everything was safe for you, Dad. That's all. I looked at him, but not with a father-in-law's eyes anymore. I looked like a man who'd just dodged a knife he hadn't seen, a prey that had slipped the trap. I remember our conversation, every word very clearly. The air in the room thickened. Damien shifted, unsure where to stand. His hand nervously wiped the tabletop, his eyes blinking rapidly. He opened his mouth several times, then closed it, unable to speak. I spoke my last words, my voice low and steady like a final judgment. If you plan to make me a burden to be eliminated, I will become a burden you can never swallow. You will choke on it, down to your very bones. He stood frozen. I walked out the door. Didn't look back. The only thing I carried then was the truth that had just spilled from his own mouth. And it would lead me to the next step. I would no longer be the weak, easily fooled old man. I sat in the office of Attorney Benedict, the man my wife had trusted most in life. The room was still the same, the scent of old oak, the soft yellow glow from a classic desk lamp, filing cabinets stacked neatly to the ceiling. Only I was no longer the same. I recounted everything that had happened. Every detail. Every word Damien spoke that night. Even the moment he'd confessed. The lawyer listened without interruption, just an occasional slight nod, his keen eyes hidden behind gold-rimmed glasses. When I stopped, the room fell silent for a few seconds. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock. Then he placed both hands on the desk and spoke slowly, as if afraid I couldn't bear the truth. Mr. Harold, what you've described is no longer suspicion. These are the hallmarks of a deliberate scheme to seize assets. Even murder. A chill ran down my spine. But I wasn't trembling anymore. A fire of rage had ignited within me. I sat up straight. Took a deep breath. I don't want anything else to happen. I need to know what I'm up against. I need him to pay. He nodded, his lips pressed tight. So, we'll proceed in 3 steps. 1. Protect all your assets immediately. Cut off his access. 2. Sever every possible connection Damien has to your documents, property, insurance completely. 3. Investigate everything he's done before. Everything. The way he spoke, calm and resolute, made me feel, for the first time, that I wasn't alone in this fight. He opened a desk drawer, pulled out a stack of documents, and asked me to sign some temporary power of attorney papers to separate Damien from everything concerning me. My hand trembled as I signed, but a fire burned in my chest, a fire of pure determination. A moment later, his most trusted financial investigator walked in. Mr. Davies. A man of few words, he shook my hand with a firm grip, then opened his laptop. The lawyer spoke briefly. We need to know what Damien has touched. The more details, the better. Mr. Davies nodded, then worked ceaselessly, his eyes darting between spreadsheets and lines of code, as if reading the language of debtors. Only half an hour later, he turned his laptop screen towards me. Take a look. I looked at the first list. Transactions from my own account. Some I'd never heard of. Never authorized. The dry, stark lines hit me like slaps to the face. One after another. Request to open new credit line under Mr. Harold Fenton, denied. Application for personal loan with Mr. Harold Fenton's home as collateral, insufficient documentation. Medical information, severe heart condition, uploaded to new insurance system. I froze. My whole body turned to ice. I never sent these. Never. Mr. Davies spoke softly, his voice even, but every word was a knife. The person with access to your accounts has tried. Many times, and very recently. I closed my eyes for a few seconds. My chest tightened. A knot of pain twisted inside me. Damien had said, "Let me handle it for you, Dad. You're not good with these things." And I trusted him. Trusted him enough to let him set my passwords. Trusted him enough to let him check my bank emails. Trusted him enough to become prey for a fox. The lawyer switched the screen to another folder. This is the more important part, Damien Crow's accounts. I stared at the numbers flooding before my eyes like a raging torrent, credit card debt piled on top of old credit card debt. Strange personal loans, vague notes, unclear purposes. Then, long lines of payments to betting sites. Online casinos. Unfamiliar addresses. Enormous figures. Each line told a story, his second life, the life I knew nothing about, the life he'd hidden so well. He almost killed me to keep it buried. I swallowed hard. My throat burned. This much? He owes this much? Mr. Davies replied, his voice low. And it's growing. Damien is desperate for money, very desperate. Your upcoming surgery? He likely saw it as an opportunity to unlock every financial door. A way out, so he wouldn't have to face his mountain of debt. That sentence was a cold knife plunged into my heart. I pictured his face from last night, his darting eyes, his rapid-fire questions, his unusual panic when he learned I hadn't eaten the soup. Now it all fit. Every single piece. Forming a perfect picture of depravity. I asked, my voice hoarse as if I'd just recovered from a fever. What if I hadn't taken the soup to Mrs. Alden's? Attorney Benedict looked at me, his eyes gentle, yet heavy. You might have been in the emergency room. Or much, much worse. Much, much worse. I clenched my fists until my knuckles were white. Bloodless. Not from fear, but from rage. A bone-chilling anger. So furious, my hands trembled violently. The lawyer placed a thick, freshly printed file in front of me. I want you to see this. This is everything we found. I opened it. Looked at the notes, the red verification marks, the transaction copies. No more doubt. This was the naked truth. Damien wasn't just targeting me. He was dragging the whole family into his abyss of debt. He intended to use my old age and illness as a bridge to cross his own chasm. He saw my life as a commodity, something to trade. My hands trembled, but my eyes, they shone brighter. For the first time in months, I saw the full picture clearly. I saw the only path I had to take. I closed the file, pushed it gently towards the lawyer, and a strange sense of peace settled over me. Now I'm ready. Ready for anything. The lawyer nodded. A faint smile touched his lips. Good. The next step, you shouldn't go alone. You need someone who understands you best right now. I stood up, took a deep breath, looked at the dim light outside the window. Only one person in my family could truly understand this pain. And I needed her now more than ever. I needed my daughter. I left the lawyer's office. My hand still clutched the file tight, as if letting go would make everything crash down, turn into a nightmare. I stood before a small cafe near the hospital. Called my daughter. Her voice, when she picked up, was light. Just like always. I told her I wanted to meet. She hesitated just a bit, then agreed. When she walked into the cafe, the afternoon sun behind her made her face look both familiar and strangely distant. She sat across from me. Her hand rested on the steaming teacup. Dad, you're worrying me. Damien told me you misunderstood something. He's been under a lot of pressure lately. My heart sank as I listened. She was still on her husband's side. Like so many times before. I didn't blame her. She trusted the man she loved. I used to be like that. I placed the file on the table. Slid it towards her. Just look at this first. She frowned, opened it. Read a few lines. At first, confusion. Then incomprehension. Then she looked up at me, as if waiting for me to say, just kidding, but I didn't smile. I told her everything. About the soup. About Mrs. Alden in the hospital. The frantic call. Damien's voice breaking when he learned I hadn't eaten. And finally, his confession. Her face cycled through emotions, like a storm passing through. Bewilderment, then fear, then raw anger. She shook her head again and again. No way! Damien! It can't be! I let her speak. Everyone needs time. Time for their heart to accept a truth their mind has already seen. I pushed a few more papers over. Loans under my name. Requests for credit limit increases. Shady transactions. Her hand clenched. Her knuckles turned white. He used your name? What did he do with that money? I said softly. Gambling. Debt piled on debt. Her eyes welled up. A tear fell onto the paper. I didn't know anything. I sighed. Neither did I. She buried her face in her hands. He said he worried about you. He said you were old, shouldn't manage your own finances. I thought he was good. I looked at her. Saw an image of myself just a few months ago. Trusting the wrong person. Trusting with everything I had. It's not just me, I said slowly. If his plan had gone through, you'd be dragged in too. Those loans. If something happened to me, they'd fall on you. She dropped her hands. Her expression changed. No more defense. No more trying to protect him. Only pain. And betrayal. He betrayed me too? I nodded, though I desperately wanted to deny it, to spare her pain. She took a deep breath, then sat up straight. Her voice hardened. What do you need me to do? I pushed the second file towards her. Emails, messages, documents, anything that proves Damien ever asked about my accounts, ever mentioned power of attorney. Help me gather them. She nodded. Without hesitation. I'll do it. If I need to testify, I'll do that too. I looked at my daughter. Saw a new anger in her eyes. Not at me, but at the person who had used both father and daughter as mere tools. I saw a clarity in her gaze, one I hadn't seen in years. We were silent for a moment. Soft music played in the cafe. Distant conversations. The afternoon sun curled around the edge of our table. For the first time in months, I felt the atmosphere between us wasn't heavy. We were on the same side. No more distance. No more awkward silence. I placed my hand over hers. I'm sorry I let things go so far. She shook her head. Her eyes still red. No, I'm the one who's sorry. I was too far away. I didn't see. I left you alone for too long. I smiled faintly, lighter than a breath. Now I'm not alone anymore. She squeezed my hand. No, we'll never be again. We sat like that for a long time, both looking towards the glass door, where the late afternoon sun was fading. In that moment, I knew. From here on, I wouldn't be fighting alone. I never thought I'd be sitting in a lawyer's office on a gray morning like this. Light from the window hit the thick stack of documents on the table. They chronicled every step Damien had taken to push me to my death. The lawyer looked at me, asked softly, "Are you ready?" I nodded. Just one nod. But inside, months of a tight knot had finally loosened. We took everything to the police station. The soup test results. Notes from the confrontation right outside my house. The financial investigation file, meticulously reconstructed by the expert team. Each page felt like a slap to the image of the kind son-in-law I'd once clung to. When the police opened the official investigation, I distinctly heard the pen scratch. Intentional endangerment of life. Elderly asset misappropriation. Each word sent a chill down my spine. But this time it wasn't fear. It felt like the first step. The first step to putting everything back where it belonged. On the day of the hearing, I stood before the court. My hands weren't shaking like I had expected. I recounted everything from the still hot soup to Damien's panicked eyes over the phone. I added nothing. I omitted nothing. I just spoke the truth. And the truth was heavy enough. The entire courtroom fell silent. When the doctor presented the toxins found in the remaining soup sample, I unconsciously clenched my hands. Hearing them describe the dosage, the impact on an elderly heart, I suddenly remembered the gentle clink of a spoon against the pot that day. A small sound. But now, looking back, it could have been the sound of my end. Then it was the financial investigation team's turn. They projected a large screen, displaying every shady transaction. Long, endless lines of debt. Damien's attempts to create loans in my name. Each time they clicked on a number, the whole room seemed to recoil slightly, so everyone could clearly see the true person behind that polite facade. Damien just bowed his head. No more defense. No more of that smooth voice I'd once believed. When the judge read the sentence, I heard every single word, 8 years in prison. Then restrictions related to accessing family assets. Finally, the decision to nullify all powers of attorney he had so desperately tried to secure. I didn't feel joy. No "we won" moment. Stepping out of the courthouse, there was only the cold wind, and a feeling like someone had just given me back the breath I'd lost for the past half year. My daughter walked beside me, silent. I saw her look at me. Then, at the courthouse door behind us, I asked softly, "Are you okay?" She just nodded, her eyes red, but no longer trembling like when she first learned the truth. We walked slowly on the sun-dappled sidewalk. For the first time, I saw her, not standing between me and her husband, simply standing next to me. And that was enough. Enough to know I had just stepped out of the darkest chapter of my life. I didn't win. I simply reclaimed the part of my life that should never have been lost. And thinking about the journey ahead, I understood. Everything from here on wouldn't revolve around Damien anymore. It would revolve around who I chose to become after all that had happened. I went back to my old house the afternoon after the trial. Still the creaky wooden porch whenever the wind touched it. Still the faint, damp pine scent I'd known for decades. But something had changed. Not the house. Me. I started with the smallest things. Sitting down with my lawyer. Reviewing every account, every document I never bothered to read carefully before. We locked down the access that almost cost me everything. Then set up new, clear, secure protections. All the things I should have done long ago. But only now was I clear-headed enough to start. Weeks later, I tried going to a community gathering the town held for seniors. I only planned to sit quietly, listen for a bit. But when they asked if anyone wanted to share experiences related to financial abuse, my hand shot up before I even thought about it. I didn't tell everything. Just the part I endured alone for so long. And as I spoke, I realized the room fell silent, just like in court. Not because people were shocked, but because so many others lived in seemingly peaceful homes, filled with unspoken traps. A man in the front row looked at me for a long time. He said, "I thought it was just my house." I just offered a small smile. I used to think that too. My lawyer and I decided to start a small group. Nothing grand. Just a place where seniors in the area could ask each other questions, warn each other, share documents, ask for advice when someone tried to pressure them into signing something they didn't understand. We managed to get a corner in the town library. One long table. A few stacks of flyers. Yet, almost 10 people showed up for the first meeting. One afternoon, I sat talking with an elderly woman with silver hair. Her hands still trembled from a call where her grandson asked for care authorization. She asked me what she should do. I looked at her and suddenly understood. My story, it could actually save someone. That feeling wasn't like victory. It was more like, finally, I could use my own pain to stop another's. And for the first time in months, I felt a little light dawn in my heart. I received the letter on a very quiet morning, the sparrow still perched on the wire outside, just like every day, but my hands were trembling slightly. Damien wrote that he regretted it, that he wanted to see me, just one time. I folded the letter, placed it on the table, and stared at it for weeks. I asked my support group, my lawyer, and myself. Finally, I understood. I needed to see him, not to ease his burden, but to find my own closure, to step through the very last chapter of this story. The day I arrived at the prison, the long hallway, the cold metallic scent, it all brought me back to that first hearing. Damien walked into the visiting room, slower than before, his hair disheveled, eyes sunken, his frame noticeably thinner. He began to speak of therapy, of facing himself, of how his addiction to debt and his desperate need for control had torn both our lives apart. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rush to believe. I just looked at the man across from me, and I saw not the person who once stood at my door with a pot of soup, But that didn't mean I'd forgotten. I told Damien I had once truly seen him as a son, but a love without boundaries, it had almost killed me. I forgave him, not with resentment, but that didn't reopen any doors he'd tried to grasp. No finances, no health, no decisions impacting my life. If, after his release, he truly changed, we could still maintain contact, but with enough distance, safe for both of us. When I walked out of the prison, the wind on my face felt strangely light. No sadness, no heaviness, just release. And I knew I was finally ready to speak the last words of this story. Looking back now, I finally see the truth I spent years avoiding. One quiet pot of soup, one moment of misplaced trust. That was all it took to pull me straight into the heart of a real family drama. Not because the danger was unseen, but because I kept believing that love meant forgiveness, access, and silence. I trusted Damien like a son. I handed him keys, accounts, decisions, believing I was building closeness. But all I was doing was making myself the simplest target he ever had. That's how many family revenge stories begin, not with villains in the dark, but with someone you once called your own. When I stood in court speaking every detail out loud, I wasn't just fighting for justice. I was forcing myself to confront my own boundaries, boundaries I should have drawn long before he crossed them. Love without limits isn't love. It's surrender. As seniors, we have the right to say no. To protect our accounts, our keys, our choices. To refuse kindness that hides control. If someone pressures you, rushes you, frightens you into signing or surrendering something, pause. Your peace is worth more than anyone's approval. And if you feel alone, don't carry it in silence. Every survivor I've met thought they were the only one. Until they spoke. Until they found community. So if my experience echoes something in your life, even a small moment, share it. You don't need names. Just honesty. Your story could stop another family from sliding into the same family drama that nearly cost me everything. Tell me in the comments, have you ever felt pressured, exploited, or cornered by someone who claimed it was for your own good? Your voice might give someone else the courage to speak. And if you want to hear more stories like this, more family revenge stories about self-respect, boundaries, and protecting yourself inside your own home, stay with me. We still have so much to talk about, and maybe something you say today could save someone else tomorrow.